And now those network newscasts, anchored through history by honest-to-God newsmen with names like Murrow and Reasoner and Huntley and Brinkley and Buckley and Cronkite and Rather and Russer. Now they have to compete with the likes of me, a cable anchor who's in the exact same business as the producers of Jersey Shore.
May this happen? Who's to blame?
News was invented in the mid-1800s by the owners of the penny press, many of which were sold on the streets and therefore needed to be as entertaining as possible.
Extra!
Even from its origin, these papers weren't focused on the dull business air of the large morning papers, but rather touted as melodramatic stories of true crimes, especially murder. The papers continued to titillate their audience even through the Civil War, which saw readership soar during the bloodiest battles. And by the 1880s, William Hearst's yellow press put story over news, making journalists the protagonists and even fabricating tales to entice readers.
Is that really your idea of how to run a newspaper?
This marked the fundamental distinction between entertainment and news. There were the yellow press's tales, and then there was the Times. In 1920, the tabloids emerged to carry the torch of sensationalism, relying on photos and illustrations. And these fictional stories in the form of news relied on what else but sex and murder. By 1928, Emile Gavreau began converting real people into characters and detailing their lives in entertaining pieces. The news had a new function. Personalities contracted to play out their lives for the amusement of the readers.
Sound familiar?
My husband moved out.
I am threatened with eviction.
Victor lives on cheeseburgers and cheeseburgers alone.
And my addiction is eating couch cushions.
That's enough. Yes, just as television became the successor to newspapers, the tabloids also made the jump to the airwaves, ultimately deeply embedding different forms of itself within the medium. These media were able to take the concept of the movie newsreel and added immediacy, no longer constrained by time nor space. But if television made news out of anything that had the rudiments of entertainment, it also made entertainment out of anything that had the rudiments of news.
A car left O.J. Charges laid by L.A. police against O.J. Simpson in connection with the brutal slaying of his ex-wife Nicole.
They don't know if they're heading back to Brentwood, back to the area where O.J.'s mansion is located. Possibly back. O.J. says he possibly wanted to see his mother.
Is actively searching for Mr. Simpson.
What is happening? They have to.
On June 17, 1994, O.J. Simpson led police on a chase in the Los Angeles freeway after reneging on his promise to surrender. The media immediately picked up the pursuit and began broadcasting it live. In doing so, the chase became a national fixture and a media event in and of itself. But even clearly hitting all the markers of a media event, how did the O.J. trial become such a phenomenon?
Bob, we are witnessing tonight a modern tragedy and drama of Shakespearean proportion being played out live on television. And
yes, because of Brokaw and Shakespeare, or at least storytelling as impressive as Shakespeare, or really at least as impressive as the serials that were on at the time. But that's beside the point. See, Brokaw status deemed this story among all stories the one of supreme national consequence. And of course, he was right. The chase and subsequent trial became one of the greatest media events in history, while relying on some of the oldest narrative plots. Not only does it depict O.J.'s fall from grace, it was a layered story that harkens back to the penny press moniker to write the news in such a way that it would appeal to the fundamental passions. And passion it had. Violence, wealth, status, excess, and race, each were woven into the complex and competing narrative levels. The prosecution told their story of an abusive man prone to fits of rage. The defense presented another black man wrongly accused by racist cops. The jury constructed their own narrative, hoping to find the truth.
You can't handle the truth!
Media represents all of this, and the audience interprets it. Then there's the analyses, and the analysis of the analyses.
Is this real life?
Well, it's as real as anything can be when you put a camera in the room. This was one of the first trials with gavel-to-gavel coverage, which of course suggested more democracy and more transparency, and images and video of every moment for public fascination. This in turn meant that the witnesses, the lawyers, and the judge all became characters in the greatest dramatic miniseries of all time. The 90s are known for a lot of things, and new technology is one of them. With the growth of cable and the emergence of the internet, sources of news and entertainment were becoming fragmented and varied. Several cable news channels followed the CNN model with specialized programming and the ability to compete in the 24-hour news cycle. The new commercialized technology also benefited from the populist nature of 90s media. Following the lead of popular talk radio shows that regularly incorporated listeners' calls into their programs, the TV talk show finally became a recognized, defined genre with its own increasing ratings. By the mid-1990s, the TV industry had witnessed such an expansion of talk shows that no longer did it appear that any single network, sponsor, host, or show could have an impact on the culture as a whole. Only if a topic was picked up by the entire circuit of talk shows could it become truly national. And that's exactly what happened. With plenty of airtime, the cable channels turned to cheap, OJ-focused programming, interviewing other journalists and experts, many of whom eventually were able to convert their newfound fame into their own news talk shows and book deals. And these pundits were not the only ones catapulted to national stardom. In the era of new talk show stars and pundit personalities, the audience still craved for more celebrities quicker than they were emerging. As a result, the media had to create them. As OJ's life movie became a national obsession, it began to spawn off standalone celebrities. They came equipped with their own tabloid stories and even their own catchphrases.
If it doesn't fit, you must quit.
As we've seen, news and entertainment have always been linked, but there were other reasons why non-tabloid journalists were covering the story. According to Ted Koppel, when you work for commercial television, if you want to have the freedom to do the stories that need to be done, then you have to be prepared on occasion to do the stories that people want to see. However, he also notes that there were substantive issues in the case. Regardless of the motivations, legitimate news sources were swept up with the O.J. Simpson melodrama. But in 1994, there was only one narrative they could sell. The O.J. story was able to fit the recognizable black-on-white crime narrative, and any perspectives that differed from this story were disregarded. While this media coverage seemed to favor the prosecution, the defense looked to spin its own recognizable narrative as well with a different audience in mind. Johnnie Cochran presented a black man framed by racist police officers to black journalists, pleading for them to counter what he saw as the white-controlled national media, who was demonizing his client. A rift occurred between the so-called white and black presses, which found different audiences based on race, demonstrating that racial tensions very much still exist in U.S. society, especially after the Rodney King controversy 2 years prior. Cochran's closing argument obliged the jurors to understand that their decision was not whether or not to convict O.J. Simpson, but was rather about sending a message to the LA police and America.
A felony upon Nicole Brown and find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 180. Not guilty of the crime of murder.
And so it was over. At the same time, the debate had just begun.
I was absolutely disgusted, to be honest with you. I found it to be a shock. It left my jaw hanging on the ground, and I was in awe.
I think that the jury thought it was a setup, and everybody else in America thought it was a setup.
The evidence against O.J. was so overwhelming, especially the DNA evidence. You know, it's kind of, I can't believe he got acquitted. It's amazing.
I didn't feel that the evidence was strong enough to prove that he committed those crimes. The prosecution did not present their case in such a manner to convince me.
Cochran's plea for the jury to consider everything outside the courtroom when deliberating proved to be the perfect microcosm of the 2-year-long media trial. Since the camera relayed what was happening inside the courtroom, the media focused all of its attention to everything outside of it. And while this meant that most journalists were focused on commenting and speculating on the proceedings, the National Enquirer concentrated on everything going on outside the courthouse. This was a gossip story tailor-made for the National Enquirer, which immediately put its whole staff on the case. And as a result, it was able to scoop the rest of the press. For the first time in history, the distinction between the tabloids and the Times began to blur. In fact, the New York Times actually had to do it before would have been unthinkable. Cite the National Enquirer in its own article. As David Margoluk of the New York Times described it, we had crossed some line. Something fundamental had changed. The O.J. Simpson trial did not cause this blurring of the news in tabloids. However, it was the catalyst revealing and heightening it. With new technologies, a focus on pundit and populist commentary, the desire for celebrities, social elements, and the shifting authority of news sources, the live Bronco chase found itself in the perfect storm for cultural obsession. The trial coverage was a ratings bonanza for a real-life soap opera that viewers continue to crave today. This one media event fundamentally altered news and television programming forever.